This podcast will be in 3 parts, but we are essentially over the 3 portions going to be considering how the law regulates our behaviour. More specifically, we're going to consider how it prevents, or perhaps more accurately responds to, criminal behaviour through the mechanisms of punishment. We'll spend the first portion considering various theories that have been advanced in respect of punishment. We'll then move on in the second part to look at imprisonment, before finally considering whether in fact this is the best form of punishment in a civilized society. To begin with though, let's consider for a moment the concept of justice. Is this something we think we can define easily? Well, justice often has a strong correlation with fairness. And fairness has a strong correlation with what we expect is deserved. The concept of desert is deeply entrenched in everyday morality. So we say, for example, that effort deserves success, wrongdoing deserves punishment, innocent suffering deserves sympathy or compensation, and virtue deserves happiness, and so on, and so forth. We view this as being fair. Fairness, carrying on from that, is often synonymized with justice. Think about the general allegorical graphical reference that we use to depict justice, the scales in balance. This is quite a strong statement about everything being even-handed, and about everything being fair and equitable in the justice system. So what we're really trying to say with those scales is that if there is one thing on one side, it will be counterbalanced by something equivalent on the other side. So does that mean that desert has a correlation with justice? Well, we think that the getting of what's deserved is just, and that failure to receive what's deserved is unjust. We also believe it's good that a person gets what she deserves and bad that she doesn't. We assume too that it's wrong to treat people better or worse than they deserve, and right to treat them according to their deserts. In these and other ways, the notion of desert pervades our ethical lives. But to what extent, and how does this work in relation to punishment? Most theories of punishment are rooted in moral philosophy. This raises questions about what the purpose of punishment is in terms of fairness and proportionality, sentencing. They shouldn't be too harsh, they shouldn't be too lenient, they should be proportionate to the offence that's been committed. Why do we need to punish, and what are we seeking to achieve through punishment? Not just in relation to the individual offender, but also in relation to wider society. The approach that we adopt to punishment expresses society's moral views, and that really is the focus of the next section, while we consider the purpose and underlying theory behind punishment. The main debate is between retributivists and utilitarians, so we'll focus on those. But first it's important to consider the ethical theories which underpin them. Now there are 2 broad types of ethical theory that we refer to when we're considering the purpose behind punishment. The first of these is what are referred to as deontological theories. These are moral theories, ethical theories that guide and assess our choices of what we do. It's based on doing something because it is the right thing to do, or even because it's one's duty to do so. Now retribution is really an example of that. The punishment is justified because it has value in itself, and we're not really concerned about the consequences of it as such. It is our duty to punish. It's the right thing to achieve retribution as against somebody who has committed some offence. Contrast that with the consequentialist theories of punishments. These don't see themselves as having a value of their own. They're based on doing something because it brings about a good result. So options should be evaluated by their consequences. So it's outcome based, and hence the name. It's a means to an end. And this really is what underpins utilitarian schools of thought around punishments. The punishment is justified by the good consequences that it brings about, i.e. the greatest good of the greatest number of people, more commonly referred to as the greatest happiness of the greatest number of people. Now there are some issues with that, and we'll come on to consider that in due course, but let's focus for now in a little more detail on retribution. As already alluded to, with people who favour retribution, the idea is that punishment has a value of its own. It has a protective value in the fact that it protects society from dangerous criminals by incapacitating them through either incarceration, i.e. locking them up, or, as is still the case in many jurisdictions, death. But there is also, beyond that protective element, that need to protect society from the most dangerous people, there is an assaultive element to it too. And retribution is inextricably linked with payback for the crime. As Hegel once said, punishment negates crime. It's all very tied in with the idea that you somehow atone for your actions by allowing society to punish you in an equivalent way. And this really comes from Christian and Abrahamic generally tradition, where they talk about the lex talionis, the law of retribution, and there you will see a quote from Exodus in the Bible. And if any mischief follow, then thou shalt give life for life, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, hand for hand, and foot for foot, burning for burning, wound for wound, stripe for stripe. So you can see a very clear, exact retributive model in the idea behind lex talionis. And many people do favour this kind of approach. However, it's not necessarily always appropriate for various crimes. It encourages retaliation and tends to focus on violent crimes. But what, for example, would be the appropriate punishment for a property-related crime, for criminal damage? Lex talionis in modern thinking is often seen as quite barbaric, but shouldn't be dismissed as a school of thought. And considering the idea of retribution, it should be proportionate. It's the idea of getting reciprocal justice, getting even, or getting what somebody deserves, which is the whole key issue that we referred to earlier. There are no concerns in this school of thought about the best interests or the future of the criminal. It's entirely backward looking. It looks to get the system looks to get its own back on the offender. And that actually makes it quite a popular way of thinking, particularly in certain elements of the media. For example, when the James Bulger killers were released first time round, of course, one of the detectives who'd been involved in the case, Phil Roberts, said, "Well, I think it's disgusting, I really do. They've not taken into account anything. Where's the punishment? I just can't believe it, really. I can't accept that, and it'll take a long time for me to understand how a parole board can't take into account the fact that there are people out there in Liverpool that want revenge. The killers should live on a knife point." And he said that directly after their release. So a strong feeling that justice hadn't been done because retribution hadn't been served. In support of that kind of mentality, the famous philosopher Immanuel Kant said, "Even if civil society were to be dissolved by the consent of all its members, the last murderer remaining in prison would first have to be executed, so that each has done to him what his deeds deserve, and blood guilt does not cling to the people for not having insisted upon this punishment, for otherwise the people can be regarded as collaborators in the public violation of justice. So according to Kant, retribution is a strict requirement of justice. Kant believed that any approach to punishment other than retribution would be immoral, because it treats punishment disrespectfully. Punishment is an end in itself. Again, this is illustrated by capital punishment. There are weaknesses, though, in what Kant says, and in retribution generally. The focus in retribution is on blameworthiness, and so when we think about its moral status, it's based on the irrational, the vindictive, and the arguably pre-moral inclination to revenge. It seems to revert to very basic instinct. And there's a further problem in how you decide what each crime deserves. I mean, the underlying assumption in retribution is that the criminal is inherently bad or evil and not worthy of forgiveness. So, therefore, we must obviously punish them appropriately, according to somebody who would believe in this school of thought. But we do have the problem of deciding what each crime deserves. Do we do that on the basis of the intent behind the criminal, the harm done, and how do we measure that harm? Is it the harm to the individual victim, the impact that may have had on their family? Is it social harm? What is the appropriate punishment in the case of rape? What is the equivalent of life for life in rape? Are we asking that offenders should be raped in response to them having perpetrated a rape? Should the level of violence be a consideration? Should the type of person be a consideration? Or are we literally just handing out punishment because it's deserved? What about the possibility of early release? Is that even in the minds of somebody who wants pure retribution? And does the lex talionis, i.e. the law of retribution, make sense? Does the punishment cleanse away the crime? What excuses could we take account of in dishing out retribution? Do we think about mitigating circumstances and responsibility? Do we think about provocation? Do we think about drunkenness? Do we think about personal history? Do we think about age? Forgiveness is problematic, and many victims feel strongly towards the offended. A good example of a victim having given forgiveness in recent years is Anthony Walker's mother, the young black man who was brutally murdered in Liverpool a couple of years ago. And she said, "Why live a life sentence? Hate is what killed my son, so why should I be a victim too? Unforgiveness makes you a victim, and why should I be a victim? Anthony spent his life forgiving. His life stood for peace, love, and forgiveness, and I brought them up that way. I have to practice what I preach. I don't feel any bitterness towards them, really, truly. All I feel is, I feel sad for the family." So what she was saying there was that anger was unhealthy, and that retribution, with its focus on blameworthiness, anger, and revenge, was wrong. And really, I think she is supporting the idea that we should look to the future consequences of the criminal and society as well. In terms of a more practical example of that, and again returning to the murder of James Bulger in 1993, Robert Thompson and John Venables, pictured there on the slide, when they were aged 10, murdered 2-year-old toddler Jamie Bulger in Bootle in Liverpool. Both boys admitted to taking him, beating him, and leaving him on the railway track where he was found dead. Now, this case will stick out in many people's memory. It shocked the nation and ultimately led to the age of criminal responsibility for a child to be reduced from 14 to 10. It varies across Europe, and there are some moves to re-increase it back, although it did obviously have a very direct impact on the law in this case. Initially, Thompson and Venables were given an indefinite sentence to be held at Her Majesty's pleasure, and so this really represents that kind of retributivist mentality of the wanting the punishment to fit the crime. It needs to be as severe as the public would like it to be. In sentencing, the trial judge said, "In my judgment, the appropriate actual length of detention necessary to meet the requirements of retribution and general deterrence for the murder, taking into account all its appalling circumstances and the age of the defendants when it was committed, is 8 years. 8 years is very, very many years for a 10 or 11-year-old, he added. They are now children. In 8 years' time, they will be young men." Michael Howard, in his capacity as Home Secretary and at his discretion, increased the sentence to 15 years because of the public outcry, but this was reduced back to 8 years on appeal, and the boys were released in 2001 on a life license when the parole board deemed them to be no longer a threat to the public. They were given new identities and new locations. So you can see that in high-profile cases in particular, there is a general public will for retribution, and a public outcry when a sentence was seen as too lenient. But the trial judge did try and explain that point and the purpose behind it, that 8 years was serving retribution, but was also serving to rehabilitate and give them a chance to contribute for the future, which is a bit more forward-looking than traditional retribution and reflects a little more utilitarianism. Now, utilitarianism, as a more general philosophical school of thought, concerns itself with the greatest happiness principle. Bentham was a philosopher, and he considered that there were only two intrinsic things in life, which were pain and pleasure, and that mankind would want to obviously experience as little pain as possible, and the greatest pleasure possible, or greatest happiness possible. And so he considered that the ultimate aspiration for society really was to have the greatest happiness of the greatest number of people, and therefore applying that philosophy to punishment, utilitarians would say that punishment should promote the good. Plato once said, "The purpose of the penalty is not to cancel the crime. What is done can never be made undone, but to bring the criminal and all who witness his punishment in the future to a complete renunciation of such criminality." In that sense, utilitarianism, as I've already alluded to, is a type of consequentialism, but based on the greatest good for the greatest number, the balance of pleasure and pain of individuals, and it looking to punish in order to act as a deterrent. Now, this is both as a particular deterrent, i.e. the person punished won't violate the law again while they're in prison, but also as a general deterrence, as was alluded to in Plato's quotes, the punishment of one to deter others. This is a future or a consequence oriented justification for punishments. So it's reductivism through deterrence, to reduce crime in society and to make an example of the perpetrator. And Bentham's thinking, saying that pain and pleasure are the only two natural states, would be to assume that rational beings will want to avoid pain, and having seen that punishment is a consequence of a certain action, they'll regulate their conduct accordingly so that they avoid that pain. it does also have an element of rehabilitation to it, with a focus on trying to change the behaviour of the individual to become a responsible member of society. This focuses on the good of society though rather than the wrongdoing of the individual and any atonement for it. It focuses on the future good of society. But there is something of an intrusion into the moral character of individuals by the state in applying such a philosophy, and there are a number of objections to such intrusion. As was put by Kant in objecting to utilitarianism in punishment, he said, juridical punishment can never be administered merely as a means for promoting another good, either with regard to the criminal himself or to civil society, but must in all cases be imposed only because the individual on whom it is inflicted has committed a crime, for one man ought never to be dealt with merely as a means subservient to the purpose of another. So what really Kant is saying there is, if you apply utilitarianism strictly, you could effectively be using one person as a means to an end, and so you can't punish someone just to advance the social good. There has to be a reason for it. And as Marx added to that, what right have you to punish me for the amelioration or intimidation of others? In other words, why should you make an example of me just for the good of society if I don't deserve it in the first place? And this is echoed further by C.S. Lewis. Now Lewis said, when you punish a man in terrorem, you make of him an example to others. You are admittedly using him as a means to an end, someone else's end. He continued, take away the deserts, and the whole morality of punishment disappears. Why in heaven's name am I to be sacrificed to the good of society in this way? Unless, of course, I deserve it. So, Lewis makes the point there about you can't punish somebody in order to have, or to achieve rather, a general deterrence, unless they have committed an offence and they do deserve it. But in justifying punishment on the basis of utilitarian philosophy alone, you can't actually say that it's necessarily a moral or a morally correct thing to do. So in terms of the key weaknesses in utilitarianism, it would seem to be that you're punished because your punishment has good consequences, but these are for the common good, and that desert and proportionality are completely irrelevant to the equation. Building on from that then, could we use a wildly disproportionate punishment if the consequences for society were excellent? For example, if there were to be no ceiling on the extent of the punishment, and give the example visually there, if cutting people's limbs off was found to be excellent in deterring shoplifters, would we be justified in doing it? According to utilitarians, perhaps we might. Could we even punish the innocent if the consequences were good? According to utilitarians, we might. These issues will be picked up in further reading as we progress through the course. But for this portion, I'd like to conclude by looking at one or two other more modern perspectives and theories around punishment being an expressive idea. Nozick is a professor of law and criminology, and it is said that punishment has an expressive purpose. It expresses society's disapproval for wrong and society's moral beliefs, regardless of whether or not it deters anybody else. It states or makes clear the position that society as a whole will take on certain practices. Punishment can also be educative. You can use the law to change society's views and to persuade people. And this happened through mass campaigns on, say, for example, drink driving, which used to be a relatively common activity, but most people now morally, socially frown upon it. So what Nozick says is retributive punishment communicates to the offender, this is how wrong what you did was, and reconnects him with the values he has flouted. If the offender responds positively to the message through exhibiting remorse, i.e. if the connection works, it is a bonus. Now, an American political philosopher, Gene Hampton, has said further to this that punishment is necessary because a moral injury is caused by the crime. A person's value is diminished by another's immoral behaviour, and the victim is therefore seen as of less value. And she says that the state should therefore give value to the victim and give value to substantive moral values. She says that the offender sends out a rights-violating message of domination or mastery over the victim by offending against that victim. The wrongdoer lays false claim to his superior worth. Society must respond, she says, to reassert or restore the worth of the victim, or else the victim is demeaned or defeated. The offender must be forced to suffer defeat by the victim on a similar scale through punishment. And that is perhaps a more modern way of looking at the purpose and the utility behind punishment. In the next part, we'll move on to look at imprisonment and incapacitation. This is the second of three parts of the podcast relating to how the law regulates our behaviour, but focusing more specifically, as we have done, on crime and punishment, and why and how our behaviour is restricted through the mechanisms of punishment. So last time we considered and spent quite a while discussing various theories on punishment, and we looked at two main schools of thought, one which was around retribution and one which was around general consequences. Now we move on to consider the use of imprisonment for punishment. Now all kinds of claims are made about prisons, but how valid are they? In order to answer the question which you will often hear in the media, does prison work? We need to know what prisons aim to do. It's often said that we send people to prison as punishments, not for punishments. We protect the public from more serious offenders by incapacitating them. But can, do and should prisons rehabilitate people? Often, as we will see in a few moments, we return people back into the community after a period inside to worse situations than the one that led them to be there in the first place. So let's start
by looking at the present position. The statistics on the slide were obtained just over a week ago, and they show that the current prison population stands at 86,499. And that was slightly down from the prison population the previous Friday, and down more significantly from the same Friday in 2011. But it perhaps has to be remembered that in 2011 the capacity of prisons was stretched somewhat in response to the troubles, the looting and the riots that took place across many cities in England. And so the figure this time last year would have been skewed somewhat upwards. It's notable that out of that prison population, that the number of women and girls is quite low, at 4,139. So therefore, the majority of the prison population in the UK is male. And Britain has the highest prison population in Western Europe. But why is that? Is it something about UK governmental policy, which means we aren't getting it right? Is there a more effective way of punishing people? Or is prison really the best way to handle criminals? Well, the up until very recently Justice Secretary and now Minister without Portfolio Ken Clarke certainly thought prisons not to be the best form of punishment. And in an interview with The Times last year, he was quoted as saying,
"It is just very, very bad value for taxpayers' money to keep banging them up and warehousing them in overcrowded prisons where most of them get toughened up." So hardly a ringing endorsement there from Ken Clarke. But let's look at why prisons seem to be so overcrowded. What is it around sentencing practice that seems to have so many? Well, more than 17,000 prisoners were sentenced for violent crimes, and this is the biggest group in all prisons in England and Wales. A further 10,000 were found guilty of drugs offences, and about 8,500 of burglary, though this doesn't take into account other forms of theft, and particularly the looting which took place across much of England in the summer. Earlier on in summer 2011, about 14,650 prisoners were serving life or indeterminate sentences, but more than half of prisoners serve less than 6 months. About 1 in 5 prisoners is being held on remand. So actually very few prisoners are actually on indefinite sentences or life sentences, and there is some element of truth in what you may hear in elements of the media referring to as revolving door prisons with the shorter sentences. You can see that more than half serve less than 6 months. So is prison really the most effective way to deal with all of these different offenders, considering their different characteristics? Well, let's consider the general social characteristics of prisoners. And in research that has been published, almost half of prisoners ran away as a child, compared to just 11% of the general population. About 1 in 3 female and half of male prisoners were excluded from school, and a majority have no qualifications. Does this perhaps suggest that problems began at home, with parenting, or that problems began at school, with teachers? One other striking characteristic with prisoners is that less than 5% of the general population have 2 or more mental disorders. Now this is compared with 72% of male and 70% of female sentenced prisoners. So there are some striking social differences with the kinds of people who may find themselves in prison. But what about looking forward? If people are to be imprisoned for crimes that they commit, what happens afterwards? Well, as has already been alluded to, reoffending rates among offenders are high. About 2/3 are reconvicted within the space of 2 years of release. Among young men aged 18 to 21, the rate is actually higher at 3/4. In trying to examine reasons for this, perhaps accommodation could be an issue, and perhaps employment could be an issue. Accommodation problems are common. Nearly 1 in 3 will not have somewhere to live upon release, and a majority of prisoners will have no job to go to, and 6 out of 10 employers automatically exclude those with a criminal record. So, on the basis of these difficulties and the high rates of recidivism, i.e. reoffending, it's unsurprising that the prison population continues to grow. But are we imprisoning people because they are the most dangerous people, most dangerous offenders that is, or are we imprisoning them because they're the most difficult people to deal with in society? Many prisoners in modern prisons are actually quite young. Approximately 3,000 are aged 15 to 18, and this has more than doubled in the last 15 years. 48% of people in prison have reading difficulties. 27% of prisoners have spent time in care. 2/3 of women show signs and symptoms of neurotic disorders, and more than half of all elderly prisoners do so. 52% of men and 71% of women in prison have no qualifications, compared with just 15% of the general population. So, is this actually dealing with dangerous people, or is it dealing with people who have been let down by other services in society? Is it even possibly a mechanism of control of these populations? Well, 67% of the prison population were unemployed before imprisonment. 66% of male prisoners used drugs before imprisonment, and 63% engaged in what is referred to as hazardous levels of drinking. Nearly 3/4 of young offenders were excluded from school. Perhaps a striking statistic is that in 2002 there were more African Caribbean entrants to prison than there were entrants to UK universities, and 1 in 4 prisoners are from a minority ethnic group, compared with 1 in 11 in the general population. So, is this system correct? These statistics seem quite striking. They seem to show an imbalance as against the general population, and they seem to show an injustice somewhere, whether that be a social injustice or otherwise, as has been put by others. The Scottish poet Tom Leonard wrote, "And their judges spoke with one dialect, but the condemned spoke with many voices, and the prisons were full of many voices, but never the dialect of the judges. And the judges said, no one is above the law." Leonard explained himself that the law is full of examples in which people are judged in a language or an idiom that they don't understand. This is the standard case with asylum seekers who are routinely asked by immigration officials to present their case and to recount the brutalities and torture they have suffered in a language they don't even speak. Leonard notes the violence of injustice begins when the judge and the judged do not share a language or idiom. It continues when all traces of particularity of the person before the law are reduced to a register of sameness and cognition mastered by the judge. Indeed, all legal interpretation and judgment presuppose that the other, the victim of language's injustice, is capable of language in general, man as a speaking animal. This really reinforces some of the issues which have been considered elsewhere around the need for judicial diversity. But in order to attain full justice, perhaps Leonard gives weight to those arguments even further. In the next section, we'll consider the move towards prison as a form of punishment. Historically, prisons were not the favoured way to punish, and we'll consider why that has come to be.